Today's video is kindly sponsored by Bright Cellars, a monthly wine club that matches you with wine that you'll love. Find out more later in the video. Hey, 42 here. If you're old enough to drink alcohol, you've probably had one of those nights where 1 minute you're in a bar, drunkenly chatting away with your friends, and the next thing you know, you're waking up in bed with a splitting headache and a Big Mac stuck to your cheek. Now, imagine that same scenario, but this time, instead of waking up in your lovely, comfortable bed, you wake up in the damp confines of a merchant ship, hundreds of miles from home, with the ship's captain towering over you, demanding that you go and scrub the poop deck. The good news is the poop deck isn't an area of the ship reserved for bowel movements. It's the bit built on top of what is usually the captain's cabin at the back of the ship. The odd name comes from the French word for stern. The bad news is you've been kidnapped and are being forced to work as a sailor. A situation that could last for months, maybe even years. Unfortunately, it's the 17th century, so you can't just whip your phone out and call the police. Not that it would make any difference if you could, because, believe it or not, this kind of kidnapping was perfectly legal. Well, mostly. Welcome to the strange world of crimping. And no, this video has nothing to do with hairstyles. People always say you should enjoy the little things in life. And for me, that's opening a new bottle of red wine and finding out it's just perfect for my taste buds. And that's exactly why I like Bright Cellars. Bright Cellars is a wine box experience that matches you with wines from all over the world, curated to your palate. And with hundreds of private label wines, you'll be able to try a new wine that you've never tasted before. Bright Cellars does all this by giving you a quick and simple 7-question quiz with fun questions like, what's your favorite chocolate? This will outline your taste preferences and make sure they deliver wines that you're just guaranteed to love. But it's not just about drinking the wine. What I love most about Bright Cellars is you can easily educate yourself on the wines you're drinking, thanks to the wine education cards that come with every bottle. They outline the tasting notes, suggested pairings, optimal serving temperature, and origin, making you the ultimate at-home wine connoisseur. Bright Cellars is a 5-star experience for me. I think their wine, service, personalization, convenience, and sustainability are all unbeatable. And Bright Cellars have been extremely generous because they're offering my viewers 60% off your first 4-bottle box. All you need to do is follow the link in the description below to take the quiz and get started today. Thanks. Crimping, also known as Shanghaiing, as many of the kidnapped people ended up being shipped to Shanghai, was essentially an act of finding sailors for understaffed ships. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when crimping was common practice, trade routes and naval operations underpinned the backbone of the American economy, and seasoned sailors were always in short supply. That made crimping essential if the cogs of the maritime machine were to continue turning. It also meant crimping was an extremely lucrative business, with some so-called crimps earning as much as $9,500 a year. That's around $250,000 in today's money. That's a lot of cash, but in many cases the money was well earned. You see, people weren't exactly queuing around the block for the chance to sail the 7 seas. That's because life at sea during the Age of Sail was, well, a bit shit. Ships were often infested with rats, food was scarce, disease was rife, and to rub seawater into the wound, the pay was awful. If you were brave enough to complain about any of this general misery, the repercussions were harsh. Punishments for disobedience included being tarred and feathered, whipped with the dreaded cat-o'-nine tails, or, for more serious infringements, death by hanging. Fortunately for the crimps, most ships' captains were desperate enough for hands on deck that they'd accept almost anyone on their crew. That meant pretty much any able-bodied man was worth Shanghaiing. But of course, simply asking a random passerby if they fancied a life of back-breaking labour aboard some random ship wasn't especially effective, which meant crimps had to get creative. One of the more common techniques employed was to buy an old, dilapidated building near the waterfront and turn it into a boarding house. Once open, the crimp would entice local vagrants inside by offering them some kind of irresistible stay now, pay later offer. Then, all they had to do was sit back and watch as their tenants racked up a debt they'd never be able to pay back. At that point, the crimp would simply inform the unlucky soul that they were legally required to join the crew of one of the many ships waiting in the nearby harbour in order to pay back their debt. In return for supplying him with a brand spanking new crew member, the ship's captain would pay off the debt, along with a bonus for the crimp, known as blood money. That might sound like a lot of pay for an inexperienced crew member, and it would have been, except the payments would then be deducted from the sailor's future wages. Everyone was a winner. Well, except the person who was forced to endure a life of misery at sea, completely against their will. As the need for sailors grew, crimps began resorting to even more nefarious methods in order to meet the increasing demand. Setting up a fake boarding house was all well and good, but it took time. Some crimps sought faster methods, including befriending people in bars before spiking their drinks with opium. Once the victim was out for the count, they would be wrapped up in a canvas tarp, taken to the harbour, and sold like fish at a market stall. As you can imagine, it took a certain calibre of person to do that kind of work. You didn't last long as a crimp if you concerned yourself too much with silly things like morals or other people's feelings. And when it came to not giving a toss about other people, nobody came close to Portland's king of the crimps, Englishman Joseph Bunco Kelly, a man who claimed to have crimped 2,000 men and women over the course of his 15-year career. Kelly arrived in Portland sometime in the late 1800s and soon gained a reputation as an expert conman who would do just about anything to make a fast buck. The word bunco is a 19th century term for a con, and Kelly more than earned that nickname. On one memorable occasion, when he'd found himself unable to locate a suitable victim to Shanghai, he resorted to selling a life-sized wooden statue of a Native American, known at the time as a cigar store Indian, wrapped up in a tarp. By the time the oblivious skipper had unwrapped the body to discover a wooden statue instead of an able-bodied seaman, the ship had already set sail and Kelly was back on dry land with $50 in his pocket. But Kelly's most revered con would happen after a chance encounter with a bungled robbery. Whilst walking through the streets of Portland in the dead of night, he came across an open cellar door. Being the opportunist that he was, Kelly decided to take a sneaky peek inside. And there, lying unconscious on the floor, were around 20 men. Kelly couldn't believe his luck. If you're wondering why 20 men happened to be unconscious in a random cellar, it transpired they'd recently broken in, believing it belonged to the saloon above. Unfortunately for them, but fortunately for Kelly, it actually belonged to the local undertakers, and all that lovely booze they thought they'd been drinking was in fact embalming fluid. By the time they'd realised their mistake, it was far too late. Kelly had struck crimping gold, a gift from Father Crimpmas himself. A ready-made shipment of sailors who had even gone to the trouble of rendering themselves unconscious for ease of transport. Kelly didn't waste any time. He took the men down to the docks where he sold them for $52 apiece to the captain of a ship called the Flying Prince. Unfortunately for the captain, it turns out that downing embalming fluid is liable to give you much more than a headache. And when he calls for all hands on deck sometime later, he discovered his new crew was dead to a man. It's worth pointing out that some historians dispute the validity of stories like these, for obvious reasons. But whether or not the finer points have been embellished over the years, there's no denying that Kelly was an exceptional crimp. He was even deemed worthy to work alongside the head of Portland's largest crimping empire, Larry Sullivan. Sullivan was a former prizefighter who turned to a life of crimping after a brutal 75-round boxing match had, unsurprisingly, left him considering his retirement options. But Sullivan was no mindless f***. He had brains to match his brawn. He essentially unified Portland's unruly crimping scene and turned it into a well-oiled machine with him at the helm. This rise to power meant Sullivan made many friends in high places and soon found himself rubbing shoulders with Portland's political elite. To begin with, Kelly and Sullivan seemed to make the perfect team, but one thing always stood between them: politics. Kelly was a staunch Democrat and Sullivan a Republican. And it wouldn't take long for these political differences to cause friction between the two men. The resentment came to a head when the leader of the Oregon Republican Party was tried for his alleged involvement in an industrial-scale opium smuggling operation. Not only did Kelly appear as a witness for the prosecution, he also made the mistake of testifying that he was in partnership with Sullivan. Being associated with the prosecution of an important Republican risked damaging Sullivan's political connections, and when he confronted Kelly about the trial, the ensuing argument is said to have developed into a street fight that saw the two men being arrested and thrown into jail. Soon after their release, Kelly was accused of murdering an elderly man in a botched Shanghaiing attempt after the man's body was found partially dismembered in a nearby river. Kelly protested his innocence, claiming he'd been framed by Sullivan, and there's every chance he was telling the truth. After all, it seems unlikely that a man who'd spent his life perfecting the art of crimping would struggle to kidnap a pensioner. Not to mention the fact that the corpse in question had been found wearing a solid gold watch. I mean, come on. Kelly was a guy who'd probably Shanghai his own grandmother. The idea he'd pass up on the opportunity to steal a perfectly good gold watch from a lifeless corpse seems a bit of a stretch. But unfortunately for Kelly, his luck had run out. He was sentenced to life behind bars. The commotion surrounding the murder resulted in Kelly's notoriety peaking, and in all likelihood, it's for this reason his infamy rose above the many other crimps in operation during his time. Kelly was eventually released some 13 years later, at which point he attempted to take his career in a new direction by writing a book about his experiences behind bars. But the book was a flop, and defeated and penniless, Bunco Kelly faded into obscurity. By the early 20th century, the tables had begun to turn on the practice of Shanghaiing. Over the years, new laws had gradually stacked up that made the life of a crimp increasingly difficult. The emergence of steam-powered boats also meant crews were becoming smaller, and ships had less need for unskilled deckhands. By 1915, Shanghaiing was finally made illegal all across the US. So, next time you wake up feeling a little worse for wear after a night out, perhaps you can take some solace in the fact that, as bad as you may feel, at least you haven't woken up on some random ship destined for Shanghai. Thanks for watching. Good news, you can now pre-order my new book, Bread and Circuses, What Did the Romans Ever Do for Us? It's a wild and witty journey for 1,000 years of unexpected Roman history. told in a refreshing way, and packed full of incredible and unbelievable stories. Copies are selling out fast, so pre-order yours today to lock it in. Thank you.